to blame the minority for
All right, I'm back. Sorry, I had to leave.
The obvious. The majority of votes in the
But
House
we continue.
and the Senate belong to the Republican Party. If there's going to be a budget, it is fair to assume that they would have to lead in that effort. I look forward to seeing that leadership. We've seen precious little of it so far. Mr. President, on a completely separate note, I realize that the President made these statements during the course of his campaign, but it still came as something of a shock when the first day of his presidency, Donald Trump decided to issue a blanket pardon for those who had been convicted for the January 6th riot that took place in this building. For those of us who were physically present, it's a moment we'll never forget. The Vice President of the United States was sitting in your chair, presiding over the United States Senate as we addressed the constitutional responsibility of counting the electoral votes. It was roughly 10 minutes after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when someone came along in a suit, walked up to the Vice President of the United States, grabbed him by the arm and pulled him off of the chair. Those of us who were here wondered what was going on. Oh, we could hear the demonstrators outside, but we didn't understand why the Vice President was being removed from this chamber. A member of the Capitol Hill Police then walked up to where you're sitting and announced that this was going to be a safe room. Yes, there were demonstrators outside, even some in the building, but stay here. The Senate chamber will be a safe room. And be prepared for others to come into this safe room to avoid any conflict with the demonstrators. That instruction lasted for about 10 minutes. And then the same officer came up and stood before us and said, change of plans. Everybody evacuate this room as quickly as possible. We all headed out that door, going to another building on Capitol Hill that we thought might be safer away
This
from
guy's
the
so boring. Oh my
demonstrators.
God.
Think about that, Mr. President.
This
The
guy's
Capitol
voice
of the
doesn't like
United
go up or
States of
down at
America,
all.
taken over by
Monotone.
demonstrators.
I don't
The
even
United
want to
States
listen.
Senate and House of Representatives stopped in progress of doing their constitutional responsibility of counting the electoral votes. And we've seen the videotapes, and there are plenty of them, that show these mob demonstrators breaking the windows to get into the Capitol building, knocking down the doors, and then beating up on the police officers.
How about BLM?
Mr. President, when you and I came to work this morning, there were men and women, some in uniform, others in plain clothes, standing in the corridors of this building. Their responsibility is to keep us safe and to keep those who visit this Capitol safe. They are prepared, many of them have to be prepared to risk their lives to do it. And to think what they went through on January 6th is outrageous. They were beaten up by these mobsters, these thugs, these demonstrators who were egged on by the President of the United States to come up and go wild in the United States Capitol. Oh, they went wild.
Told him to go home.
Spraying bear spray.
This is all
in the
just
face of
already proven stuff,
policemen,
man. I don't know why they keep
beating
saying
up
this
on
shit.
them with poles and pieces of
Like, it's
furniture.
getting old. Like, if you're gonna
Yes, it was a
complain,
pretty wild occasion.
put something
And
new
it was
that's
a
already
criminal occasion.
defeated.
And it led to the most extensive criminal prosecution in the history of our country. Some 1,600 people were prosecuted for their conduct on January the 6th. And I will tell you, as someone who witnessed that and went through that experience, they deserved it.
Was he there? He was
It just
fighting?
strikes me as outrageous. If you heard on the news this afternoon that the Houses of Parliament in London had been invaded by a mob, they had beaten down the doors of the House of Commons and took control.
You know,
of
it's a lot more
you would've said
nuanced
that's
than what the hell this
impossible.
guy's saying.
That
Because
doesn't
like some
happen
of them were
in a
let
civilized
in. It's on
country like
video. I mean,
England.
some of them did get
It certainly
rowdy. They
shouldn't happen
deserve
in
to
the
go to
United
jail,
States,
but
and it did.
it's
And I
not like
witnessed it.
blanket one way or the
And
other.
then came the President of the United States in his first day in office, and what did he do? He decided that every single person arrested for a crime related to January 6th should be released with a full and unconditional pardon. And that's what he did. I asked my staff, let's keep track of these people and see what happened to them in the 3 weeks that have passed since the President made that decision. There's some interesting stories, sad stories. Emily Hernandez pleaded guilty to entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds in relation to her actions on the Capitol on January 6th. Ms. Hernandez was seen holding a stolen, broken nameplate of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She served 30 days in federal prison and was released. Days after being pardoned by President Trump, days after being pardoned by
Sorry, I
President
can't listen to
Trump.
this guy.
She
This
was
is
sentenced
ridiculous.
to 10 years in prison.
Let's go to the next guy. It's just,
2022
he's so boring to listen to.
Talking about improving the health of all Americans. So I would like to outline some of the priorities that Mr. Kennedy should focus on at Health and Human Services.
I thought this is for
Obviously,
Tulsi. Why are you talking about
I'm
Kennedy?
Asking him to focus on things and issues that are very dear to my heart.
My
and
heart.
Take up a lot of my time
My
as a
time.
senator from Iowa and a person very concerned about the quality health care in rural America. Our country spends more than $4.5 trillion annually on health care. Growing health care costs don't just strain Americans' pocketbooks. Health care is also a major driver of widening budget deficits and the federal government's unsustainable fiscal outlook. We're not getting our money's worth for all of that spending.
Absolutely, I agree on that.
Major health care program spending eats up 34% of the federal revenue today, and that will grow to 41% of revenue by 2055.
That's a long
Mr.
time from
Kennedy
now.
must, and I think he's committed to, ensuring that the key health programs, such as Medicare and Medicaid, are protected and strengthened by rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, more bang for the buck if you get rid of the
Nominee
waste.
must increase transparency and accountability. These actions will help make our healthcare system more efficient for the taxpayers and the consumers. I'm the author of major and more recent updates to the federal government's most powerful tool in fighting fraud, and that's people that use the False Claims Act. Since the enactment of this legislation, I'm talking about reforms to the False Claims Act, the federal government has recovered more than $78 billion lost to fraud and saved billions more by deterring would-be fraudsters. People in the Justice Department, both Republican and Democrats, say that the False Claims Act is their best tool to get after these fraudsters. In the 1 year of just 2024, and Attorney General Garland reported this to me just a couple days before he left office. In 2024, there was more than $2.9 billion in False Claims Act settlements and judgments, with $1.7 billion of it involving the healthcare industry. Now, as you know, I listen to a lot of whistleblowers, and whistleblowers were responsible for helping recover nearly all of that $1.7 billion. And I think I discussed the False Claims Act and the use of it by soon-to-be Secretary Kennedy. He seemed to be very enthused about listening to whistleblowers and use of the False Claims Act. And I think that he was probably being made aware of it for the first time. So I hope he will look into how he can use this act, and particularly by listening to reports from whistleblowers of the waste of taxpayers' money. Now, the Justice Department and HHS in combination need to more aggressively go after healthcare waste, fraud, and abuse, and empower and encourage whistleblowers. My top healthcare priority is lowering the cost of prescription drugs. We can start by putting more sunshine on pharmacy benefit managers' practices and holding these PBMs accountable. We should also establish price transparency on prescription drug TV ads. Knowing what something costs before buying it is just common sense and very helpful to the consumer. Transparency will bring more accountability and lower costs to consumers. Mr. Kennedy must also protect and improve access to rural health care. The previous administration dragged its feet in opening up spots for what is termed the Rural Community Hospital Demonstration Programs. HHS must also listen to the concerns from rural pharmacies and ensure rural hospitals benefit from additional physician slots that Congress has authorized. I look forward to strengthening the new and voluntary rural emergency program to ensure that it's working for rural communities, extending telehealth access, and supporting physicians getting a fair reimbursement under Medicare. I also expect HHS to support healthy moms and babies by improving care coordination and using telehealth in rural areas. HHS should work with me to support kids with complex medical needs so these kids and their families are getting the right care at the right time and at the right place. Our programs helping support kids with complex medical needs covers probably 6 or, well, depending on how many problems these kids have, but they have to navigate across several different programs. And what we're trying to do through legislation we pass is to have help so that when you have to see 5 or 6 different specialists, you have somebody saying what's available and what can we do to help you make access to all this. I also expect HHS to protect the most vulnerable and older Americans. I've spoken at length with Mr. Kennedy about some comments that he made in regard to agriculture. And I've heard from farmers in Iowa and agricultural organizations and commodity groups in the state fearful that Mr. Kennedy has some radical ideas on agriculture.
I just realized you guys can't see me again.
At the end of the hour meeting I had with in his office, prior to his hearing before the Finance Committee, I was calmed quite a bit by what he told me about his views on agriculture. I hope that that calm can be maintained, but if it's not, Mr. Kennedy is sure to hear from me. So when we talked about this in my office, Mr. Kennedy prefaced our initial conversation by saying that he, as HHS Secretary, will not have jurisdiction over agriculture.
Yeah, this is Chuck Grassley.
So you can expect that I will expect him to leave agriculture practices regulations to the proper agencies, and for the most part, that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. I've also sent letters to Secretaries of Agriculture and HHS
Oh my god.
requesting
Dude, this guy's 91 years
they
old.
provide
I
information
think. Hold on.
regarding
Yeah,
conflicts
he's
of
93.
interest on dietary guideline advisory committees to increase transparency.
That's crazy.
The problem there is that there's a feeling among a lot of members of the advisory committee
He's been in the
that
Senate
they
since
may have
1981.
an unjustified
That's
conflict
insane.
of interest in what they're suggesting we eat and the type of diet that we have. So I expect Mr. Kennedy to provide Congress with confidential financial disclosure from the advisory committee before finalizing dietary guidelines, so that we know that nobody has a vested interest in however those guidelines are written. On issues of health care and agriculture, Mr. Kennedy said in his nomination hearing,
Kennedy.
I agree with all of those provisions. I'm quoting him now. I agree with
Dude, this
all
guy's
of
so
those
old. This is
provisions,
crazy. I can't believe this guy's
meaning the
90.
senator. My approach to the administration of HHS will be radical transparency. If a member of this committee or other members of the committee want information,
I think
the
this guy
doors
should
are
be the
open.
leader of the health
If
and
Congress
whatever.
asks me for information,
Shit. We need
you
the
will
secrets
get
how to
it
get to 90.
immediately. Now, I don't know whether
This
that's
lady in the
good or
back looks
no.
so
I
tired. She's
don't
about
know
ready to
whether
fall asleep.
people
She's already asleep.
in the Senate here, but particularly people outside, know how refreshing it is to have
She's
a member of the cabinet say,
She
if
fall asleep?
Congress asked me for information, you would get it immediately.
I think she's sleeping.
Because over the years that I've been in the United States Senate, it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat administration, carrying out our constitutional responsibilities to see that the checks and balances, to see that the executive branch and the president faithfully
Executive.
executes the laws is not an easy process, and we have difficulty getting answers to our questions. Now, I don't know how much of this I've had trouble with HHS in the past, but I know when
Tulsi.
Pam Bondi came to my office, I showed her a file of 158 letters that I'd written to the Justice Department in the last 4 years to get information and documents in regard to my investigations of wrongdoing, and most of them weren't answered, or if we got answers, it was nearly words on a sheet of paper, not very helpful.
Eeks.
So thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for your promise, and I'm going to quote again, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately, because that's what our job is. Every high school student learns in government about checks and balances of government, that we not only pass laws and we not only appropriate money, but we have a responsibility to the taxpayers and the citizens of this country to make sure that our president does what the Constitution says he should do, faithfully execute the laws. And cabinet people are bound by that same thing. Every cabinet member that comes to my office, I tell them about the importance of our constitutional responsibility of oversight, answering our letters, and listening to whistleblowers. And in regard to answering letters, everybody that comes before a committee is asked by the chairman of the committee, will you answer our letters? And everybody says yes, and I advise them to say maybe, so that they aren't turn out to be liars. So I expect Mr. Kennedy's agency to provide timely and complete responses to congressional oversight. Oversight allows us to hold bureaucrats accountable to the rule of law, and it helps keep
Yo,
faith
that
with
lady
the
back there is
taxpayers.
sleeping.
So, I look
She's a
forward
dozing,
to
it looks
working
like.
with Mr. Kennedy to improve the health of all Americans,
Burp.
make our healthcare system more efficient, and ensure HHS's adherence to Kennedy's radical transparency commitment. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
All right, guys, we're getting a new opponent in here. Let's see who it is. Let's see if it's corny or if it's lit. I want someone to get grilled right here.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Hairlines, let's go.
President, the governor of
Hairline
the
squad.
great state of Texas, Greg Abbott, has made a request to the United States Congress to reimburse our state for the expenses we've incurred in attempting to combat the Texas-Mexico border security crisis during the 4 years of the Biden administration. I'm proud to support this request along with my colleague,
much?
Senator Cruz,
How much?
and members of the Texas delegation in the House of Representatives. Securing the nation's borders is the responsibility of the federal government, plain and simple. Given
True.
the division
Facts.
of responsibilities between the
Because when they made them take down their chicken wire and their buoys, they said you can't do this because it's the federal government's like jurisdiction. But then they didn't do anything. They just let anybody come in.
states and the federal government, there's no doubt but that this is a federal responsibility. For 4 years, though, President Biden and Vice President Harris and Secretary of Homeland Security
Borders are-
Alejandro Mayorkas intentionally and willfully refused to enforce the laws on the books to keep the border secure and to keep our nation safe. Even before his first day in the office, President Biden rolled out the welcome mat to illegal immigrants in speeches during his campaign, inviting what ensued.
True.
Early in his presidency, President Biden ended President Trump's very effective policy known as Remain in Mexico. This very simply provided that those who sought asylum
I feel like Mexico now is gonna have something like similar to Remain in Mexico, but it's gonna be like Remain in like somewhere else, whoever's close to them.
needed to remain outside of the borders of the United States while their asylum claim was litigated and ultimately decided, knowing that only about 15% of people who claim asylum ultimately are awarded that by an immigration court. The Biden administration ended construction of President Trump's border wall and instead spent federal funds to store those materials that had already been paid
That's
for,
wild, dude. That's
squandering
wild.
taxpayer dollars in the process. And as this crisis was evolving and worsening, President Biden ended Title 42 authorities, the COVID-era policy that was the last string in place helping to keep the lid on the illegal immigration crisis. So not only did the Biden administration turn a blind eye to what was an international responsibility and thus a federal government responsibility, they went a step further and actually actively enacted policies to make it worse. The Department of Homeland Security invited more illegal immigration when it created an app for your
CBP1.
phone called the CBP-1 app, Customs and Border Protection app,
It's pretty much
which
like
allowed
a fast
migrants
lane
to
at
literally
Disneyland,
schedule an appointment
and then they come.
at a
It's
port
like
of
going to a
entry
barber.
in order to illegally enter the United States. And of course, even if those who did not claim asylum were simply paroled or released into the interior along with a work permit. So here again, there was no matter of deterrence in saying, well, if you want to enter the United States, you need to do so according to the rules in an orderly basis. Essentially, all the rules were set aside and the big green light and a welcome mat was laid out for anybody.
That's the real reason everybody
who
came,
wanted
because
to come.
they kept advertising like, yo, come on, the border's open. And then their friends are like, yeah, we're getting free money. Come here. Come destroy the taxpayer. So of course people were gonna come. Now that Trump took that away, they're not gonna come anymore.
They did. Tens of millions of people, we really don't know exactly how many, took advantage of this open border policy by the Biden administration. Let's say 10 million in round numbers. We know about 1.7 million people were gotaways, which is what the Border Patrol calls those who are evading law enforcement, who presumably are up to no good because they know they can't enter otherwise because they have either a criminal record or they're transporting drugs or engaged in some
RFK
other
Jr. is
illicit
set to be
activity.
confirmed tomorrow at 11 a.m.
At the same time that the Biden administration laid out the welcome mat to anybody and everybody who wanted to come to the United States across our border, they issued hundreds of millions of dollars in reimbursements to nonprofits and non-governmental organizations that help
NGOs,
facilitate
busting them in.
this illegal immigration through FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program. So instead of meeting their responsibilities to secure the border, they essentially funded those organizations that facilitated it. Vice President Harris was assigned the task, as we know, of being the border czar to help manage this crisis. But
Kamala,
she
the border
failed
czar.
to even understand the assignment
Absolute legend. You
and
know?
failed utterly
She did
in
nothing.
completing that assignment. She visited the Texas-Mexico border once
Maybe.
in sort of what I would call a drive-by during the 4 years that President Biden and Vice President Harris were in office. It's safe to say she
Drive-by.
had no concept
Maybe
or
a
clue
flyby.
about
I don't know about
what
drive.
conditions were like on the border and how dangerous this open border policy
Pretty
was.
sure the only reason she went is because Trump went
Clearly,
before
she
her.
didn't care and was unwilling to do anything about it. On her one and only visit to the Texas border, she steered clear of the hot spots like the Rio Grande Valley,
Yeah.
which is
She
the
had to get a
very-
PR win,
very
of course.
epicenter of the border crisis at the time. Instead, she went to El Paso for a sanitized, made-for-TV visit. Different parts of the border are very different. And instead of going to the place where she knew the action would be, she went to a place that was relatively calm and sedate. But she did it for a TV hit and no other reason.
Told you, propaganda. She didn't want. She didn't
In
want her base to know
2024,
what's really
when the
going on.
Democratic Party deposed President Biden as their nominee and coronated Vice President Harris as their presidential candidate, she suddenly found herself campaigning to be president of the United
Right.
States.
And then she changed her tune.
But she actually shirked from the responsibilities that President Biden had given her as the border czar and claimed that she never was actually tasked to oversee the migration crisis.
It was just a name, I guess.
Suffice it to say that the Biden administration's handling of the border security
see
was
how many
an
people they let in.
unmitigated disaster. As a consequence, the state of Texas, which has 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, was basically left up to its own devices. We had no choice but to pick up the slack to try to secure some semblance of basic safety for Texas
There have been
and the rest of the
9.6
country.
encounters nationwide.
Everything
but that's like
The state of
encounters, so there
Texas
could be
did to fill
more.
the gap inured not just to the benefit of the 31 million people who live in Texas, but to the entire nation. Governor Abbott initiated something called Operation Lone Star, which resulted in the apprehension of more than 500,000 illegal immigrants by Texas law enforcement. Thanks to Operation Lone Star, law enforcement arrested more than 50,000 criminals trying to make their way across the border. Texas also built 240 miles of border barriers when the federal government refused to do its job. And officers across the country have seized more than 500 million deadly doses of fentanyl.
Let's skip forward. I want
which
to see
is-
someone freak out.
Is fair.
For years, for our small business and our corporation under the Biden administration.
This guy brought out
The
a.
Biden administration made it clear to our friends and foes alike that the globalist agenda would take precedent over the safety and well-being over the American people. It's mind-boggling. Thankfully, those days are over.
What a legend. He brought out a sign.
The American people gave President Donald J. Trump a clear mandate to restore our country's superpower.
This is what I imagine Abraham
and put
Lincoln
all
sounded
Americans
like.
first, all businesses first, everybody that does something in this
America
country.
first.
And that starts, number one, with securing our borders. Like I've said many times, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. And we have really struggled in the last 4 years. That is changing. That's why the master negotiator in chief, President Donald Trump, threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada just the last couple of weeks. Over the last 4 years, the Mexican government just basically turned a blind eye while caravans of illegal aliens overran our borders. Coming from Mexico, coming from Central America, and all over the world, just overrunning our country. Thousands of women and children were trafficked, raped along the way. Drug cartels made an absolute fortune. Absolute fortune, not just with drugs, by the way, but for the payments of these illegals coming all the way through either Central America or South America to the United States with a big, basically, tariff of their own, charging these people to come to the United States. Lawlessness had become the status quo under President Biden. Nobody cared. Democrats in this room, they didn't care. They didn't care what was going on. Let's just let them all come in. Let's let the drugs come in. We lose 300 people pretty much every few days to illegal drugs in this country with overdoses. But let's don't worry about that. Let's just worry about controlling our country the way they want it to. Well, it's been a disaster. Mexico showed zero signs of willingness to negotiate when President Trump took office. When he did take office, January the 20th, they woke up real quick. President Trump correctly understands that Mexico's economy is heavily dependent on the United States of America and the citizens of this country. In fact, more than 80% of Mexico's exports come to the United States. 80% come here, and the American citizens buy those products that are made in the United States. Mexico's economy would almost instantly feel the effects of a 25% tariff, leaving Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum no choice but to come to the negotiating table under the master negotiator, Donald Trump. So that's why he uses tariffs, to get his point across, because people across the world take us for granted. As a result, within hours of President Trump's announcement of the tariffs, Mexico caved. They saw real quick. Obviously, they're not stupid. They agreed to help the United States secure the border and crack down on the cartels and the illegal drugs coming in, almost immediately, which we could have done the same thing with the past administration, but it just showed you they could care less of what happened at our border. Our neighbor to the north also caved to President Trump after a 25% tariff was threatened on Canada. Not only are illicit drugs like fentanyl coming into our country from Mexico, but there are also about 2,000% increase in drugs coming across the border in 2023 and 2024 from Canada. A 2,000% increase. In the last fiscal year alone, enough fentanyl was seized at the northern border to kill 9.8 million Americans. And to me, that would be a very serious problem. But do you think the Democrats cared? Nope. There was no action at all by the Biden administration on Canada. No action on Mexico. But thanks to President Trump's leadership, our North American neighbors from the north and south are making changes now daily that will protect American citizens from deadly drugs, criminals, and human traffickers. The number one job of the President of the United States is to protect the people in this country first, and that's what President Trump's doing. In addition to using tariffs as a negotiating tool, President Trump also views tariffs as a way to right the wrongs of past ineffective trade deals. That's why this week he's imposing a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, including those of Canada and Mexico. Contrary to what the media is telling you, this isn't unprecedented. It's not unusual. In fact, President Trump has helped shine a light on the fact that U.S. exporters face higher tariffs than more than two-thirds of the time. We pay more tariffs than anybody. For example, among our major trading partners, China applies higher tariffs on 85% of U.S. products and 90% on U.S. and 90% on U.S. products from India. Just think about that. We are paying tariffs on things coming in this country, but when we send things out, we get the heck tariffed out of us from other countries. It's not fair trade. These exports imbalances don't just impact bottom lines, they also discourage domestic production. We have got to produce more in this country. We have got to build more things in this country, and that's what President Trump's trying to do. If we don't cut back on spending and start producing more in this country, this will not be the United States of America much longer, because we will be bankrupt, and we'll be reporting to somebody like China, who is buying our Treasury bills right and left, or they were. One report conducted by the Department of Commerce in the first Trump administration found that excess production capacity, particularly China, has been a major factor in the decline of domestic aluminum production. Basically, we're getting overwhelmed by aluminum from China. That's not near as good as what we make in this country. President Trump built one of the strongest economies in a modern history in his first term. Modern history. But the Democrats failed to know that, so they wanted to change it. And did they ever? Almost destroyed our economy. Jobs and wages were up when President Trump was in, inflation was down. Americans had more money in their pocket. And thanks to President Trump's strategic tariffs, along with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, companies were reshoring businesses back in the United States right and left. They were coming back because they could make profit. And that's what it's all about when you have a corporation. You got to make profit. And President Trump was able to, because of tariffs, make more money for manufacturing in this country going out of this country. You had companies like Ford canceling plans to build in Mexico back in President Trump's first term, and instead opening one in Michigan. This turned out to be extremely important when COVID hit and we're forced to rely on goods manufactured right here in the United States. We found out pretty quick, just in drugs alone, we make very little drugs in the United States. Where are they made? They're made in India and China. They've got to come back here. We have to be self-sustaining. Whether it's our healthcare, technologies, agriculture products, or steel and aluminum, there's no reason for us to depend on other countries. We are the number one country in this world, have been and will be in the future in manufacturing and production. America has some of the best and brightest manufacturers, best and brightest producers, the farmers, and business. We take second to none. And from a national security perspective, it is